Alexander, we have an interesting news story, which is getting some traction now, especially in the United States, but it has to do with Interpol and a leadership change at Interpol. And one of the people that has been tapped to take over the leadership position at Interpol is a Russian, who is currently now the vice president of Interpol. He's been tapped to take the leadership role. His name is Alexander Prokopchuk, and the Russians are very happy about the prospect of having Mr. Prokopchuk take the leadership role at Interpol. The United States is furious, and they're not having any of it. And this ties into sanctions. It ties into a lot of the Bill Browder affair. He tweeted about it the other day. He's very, very worried. Take us into the meaning of what Interpol is and why this leadership change has a lot of significance.
Right, let's first of all get to understand what Interpol is. Now, Interpol is not an international security force or an enforcement agency or anything like that. It is basically a grouping bringing together the various police forces of around the world. And, of course, it keeps a database and an information exchange so that police forces can exchange names between them of possible suspects and information through Interpol. And at the same time, Interpol releases these famous red notices, which are notices which alert police forces in different parts of the world about a particular individual who's wanted by the police force of one or another country. And when a red notice is issued, then the individual, if he passes through a country where the police force has received the red notice, will arrest him, and that can sometimes result in extradition proceedings. So it is a very important organization. It has been around for a very long time. It has had a checkered history. It was at one time controlled by Nazi Germany during the 1940s, during the time of the Second World War, but it was then cleaned up. It is based in France, and the dominant force in Interpol since the Second World War has been the United States. If you look at the history of the people who have run Interpol, they have overwhelmingly been from Western countries, from the United States, and from Western Europe. There are two very senior officials. There is the president and there is the secretary general, and they are the two key figures. Now, what we saw is that recently a Chinese police official was appointed president of Interpol. The Chinese government has recently brought criminal charges against him for corruption, so he's had to step down. But there is now a strong possibility that a Russian police official will replace this Chinese police official and will take the leadership of Interpol. And this is extremely alarming to the United States because, of course, Interpol, with its red notices, is in a position to start acting in a more, shall we say, forceful way against various people who the United States has historically protected, like Bill Browder, who you mentioned just now, like Mikhail Hodorkovsky, the former Russian oligarch, who's also in exile, but who's now also wanted in Russia for further criminal charges. And, of course, the United States does not want that to happen.
Let me read you a tweet from Senator Roger Wicker that he sent out just literally moments ago, where he says, Senator Shahan, Marco Rubio, and Chris Coons and I oppose Russian leadership of Interpol. Russia routinely abuses Interpol for the purpose of settling scores and harassing political opponents, dissidents, and journalists. And then he attaches a link to his full statement. What do you make of that tweet sent by Senator Wicker?
It is blatant political interference in Interpol's affairs. Now, can I just say, I mentioned a short time ago about how in the 1940s, when Nazi Germany managed to take control of Europe, it gained control of Interpol. After the Second World War, there was a systematic effort to depoliticize Interpol and to depoliticize police forces around the world. And what the United States is now doing is that it is meddling in politically, for political reasons, in the activities of the world's most senior police organization. So I understand that the United States has concerns about some of these people. Realistically, even if Interpol issues red notices against Bill Browder, provided he remains in Britain or the United States, he is not going to be extradited to Russia. The same applies for Mikhail Khodorkovsky. The same applies to all sorts of people. There is no reason to think that Mr. Prokopchuk, who is a veteran police officer who's held various senior positions in Interpol for more than a decade, is going to abuse his position as head of Interpol in any way. There would be no actual logic in his doing so, or any benefit to Russia from him doing so. So I'm afraid here we have another situation where the United States, with its very strong axe to grind against Russia at the moment, is interfering in the work of an international organization because it fears that it is losing control of it to its rivals.
Does this affect in any way the standing of Assange or Snowden or some of these Western dissidents, I guess you could label them?
Well, I think this is a very good example of this because, I mean, if we're talking about Edward Snowden, I mean, the United States, even if it was to use Interpol or any of these organizations, could not actually get him back from Russia simply because he's been granted political asylum in Russia. And if we're talking about Julian Assange's position in the Ecuadorian embassy in London is a very precarious one, as we know. But again, what protects him is the fact that Ecuador has granted him political asylum. And that nothing Interpol or any organization like that can do can affect the status of these people. So in a sense, what the senators are saying in the United States, what the US government is saying in the United States, and it's important to stress it's not just Democratic or it's not just members of Congress and senators who are complaining about this election, this possible election of a Russian police official, but also all sorts of other people. And the US government itself, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, has made very clear that it wants someone else, not Mr. Prokopchuk, to become the president of Interpol. But, you know, even if Prokopchuk is elected president of Interpol, it is not actually going to change the status of anybody who politically matters. Not Assange, not Snowden, not Browder, not Khodorkovsky. I'm sorry to label these people together because I don't think there's any resemblance actually in their cases. But since we're talking about political cases, you will understand what I mean.
So what's all the fuss about? Why is the U.S. so, I mean, because they've even gotten the media on this. A lot of the mainstream media now is outraged. They're calling Prokopchuk an abuser in chief. That's a quote. That's what they're labeling him. Yeah. And real quickly, before you answer this question, Alexander, the Russian Interior Ministry spokesman Irina Volk came out with a statement as well. And she said that Prokopchuk is a respected professional. And if elected, he will be leading the organization in the interests of the international police community. So what's all the outrage about?
Well, what is all the outrage? I mean, first of all, what Volk says, I think is right. But I mean, what is all the outrage about? The United States does not want to see its geopolitical rivals leading organizations like Interpol, because if a Russian national heads Interpol, an organization like Interpol, it goes against the idea that Russia is becoming internationally isolated. Because on the contrary, we see that the world community, or at least the world police community, is actually prepared to place the leadership of its organization in the hands of a police professional. Now, Bill Browder, and Khodorkovsky have had to contend with problems of Interpol red notices. And the Russians are putting together a very, very complicated and powerful criminal case against Browder, whom they are accusing of all kinds of crimes. But as I said, ultimately, he is safe provided he remains in countries like Britain and the United States. Because even if Interpol were to issue a red notice against him at Russian suggestion, it is not going to be acted upon. And that is the reality of it. So I think partly we're seeing a PR exercise. Partly, as I said, we're seeing the United States reacting badly when an international organization slips out of its control. Partly, as I said, it is a measure of concern for people like Browder. But frankly, this is all a huge, huge storm about nothing of substance except perhaps the prestige of the United States.
Yeah, and it shows that Russia is indeed not isolated on the international stage. That's for sure.
No. And as I said, it makes a terrible precedent because, as I said, I've never known a situation where the election of a president of Interpol has become the subject of political commentary. And that is a very worrying thing. As I said, it points to the politicization of the police services. If we have a situation where Mr. Prokopchuk does not become president of Interpol because the United States objected to him, then of course people are going to start asking questions about Interpol's independence, far more searching questions than they will, because Interpol has in the past introduced red notices against Mr. Browder, which it has subsequently cancelled.
Well, we've seen many international organizations, starting with the International Olympic Committee, become politicized against Russia. So it wouldn't surprise me if something goes astray with this vote.
You're absolutely right. And I mean, we have an even more salient example now with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which, against Russian and Chinese opposition, has at US and British insistence now taken upon itself a function of attributing chemical weapons attacks, in other words, investigating them and attributing them to particular actors. Now, previously, its job was to say whether or not a chemical attack had happened. Now it will actually serve what you might call an investigative function, and it will do so at the bidding of the United States and Britain. And one has to say this frankly, one fears under their control. And the Russians and the Chinese are furious about that, and they feel yet again that the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, is becoming politicized, and as a result it is losing credibility. And this kind of attack on Interpol that we're seeing from the United States and interference in its procedures risks doing the same with Interpol, which is a much older organization.
Yeah, I mean, they end up, by trying to control these institutions outright, they end up destroying them. And you end up creating competitor institutions, very much like SWIFT, for example, where they're once again, they're getting involved in SWIFT. They're trying to block out Russia, trying to block out Iran. And you're getting these countries now forming their own institutions to handle these tasks.
You have put your finger exactly on it, Alex. This is exactly what is happening. The United States, by insisting on controlling these international bodies, these formerly neutral international bodies, is destroying their credibility by undermining their neutrality. And when that happens, we see the breakdown in the international system, which, to be very clear, has up to now overwhelmingly served the interests of the United States. It's happened with Interpol, it's happened with the OPCW, it's happened with the International Atomic Energy Authority, it's happening with all sorts of institutions around the world. And you even mentioned correctly the International Olympic Committee and WADA, the anti-doping organization. And in the end, if you undermine the credibility of all these organizations, then rival ones are set up. And of course, those rival ones begin to attract traction. And the process of globalization, which the US had promoted so actively until quite recently, until just a few years ago, takes another big step towards final collapse.
There you go, Alexander Mercouris. Thank you for your analysis on what is happening at Interpol at the moment. Guys, if you like this video, click the subscribe button, click on the notifications bell, and please go to the Duran shop, pick up a t-shirt. We have a lot of cool new t-shirts. Grab a t-shirt, it really helps us out. And you can also donate to our PayPal and Patreon page. Alexander Mercouris, thank you very much.